Welcome to episode 1 of the Life in Norway Show. I'm your host, David Nichol. This is the podcast of the Life in Norway blog, where we tell the stories of what it's really like to live in Scandinavia. Is Norway really one of the happiest places on earth? It's questions like this that I hope to answer on the show as I interview other expats who live and work right here in Norway. You can find out more, including full show notes from today's podcast, at www.lifeinnorway.net. Okay, I'd like to welcome to the Life in Norway show, Lorelou Desjardins. Have I pronounced your name right, first of all?
Yes, you have.
Excellent. Now, Lorelou, you are originally from France. You've lived in Norway for around 8 years. And despite being well known for the blog A Frog in a Fjord, you're actually a human rights lawyer, I believe.
Yes, I am. This is what I'm trained to do, and I've been working for NGOs and human rights organizations for almost 15 years now, and I still do it as a full-time job. My blog is just an additional hobby.
Excellent. So on that note, what brought you to Norway?
Well, I got this job actually in the Rainforest Foundation Norway. It was a very tempting job. I had no intention on coming to Norway. I had almost never heard of Norway. But it was a very good opportunity. I would be working on land rights of indigenous peoples in Indonesia, traveling to the jungle. And Norway had money to pay for that kind of position. So I thought, why not? I'll stay here maybe 2 years and then I'll move on to another place.
That's great. So how does a human rights lawyer end up writing a blog about Norwegians? What was the inspiration to get this going?
Well, it's not just a blog about Norwegians. It's a very unserious blog about Norwegians, where I use humor a lot, and I don't use many official reports. I use mainly my experiences. But the point was, I was trying to integrate in Norway. I was meeting a lot of challenges, which were sometimes frustrating, sometimes very funny. And I felt like I could share this with other people. And writing for me is a way of, sharing, but also I like it a lot. I feel very good when I write. So I was writing for myself in a way, and also for other people, thinking maybe some other people can be amused by my experience. Maybe they can learn something from it. Maybe I can learn something from them. Maybe they've gone through this and they've cracked the code. And so I don't necessarily give answers in all of my blog posts.
Sure,
I don't think I have all the answers. Yeah.
It's more about starting a conversation, and I see from having a good look through the blog today that a lot of those posts have an awful lot of comments. So you seem to spark a conversation, not just on the blog, but also in the Norwegian media, it would be fair to say.
Yeah. In the past 3 years, I've been writing for the biggest daily newspaper in Norway called VG. And a lot of the comments have therefore moved from my blog to the comment field in the newspaper online. And I also write now more and more for other newspapers. And so I've had also some public debates about what I've been writing, which is extremely surprising that they would have a public debate about something an immigrant is writing. I don't think that would happen in France so much. But especially on my blog post called What Do Norwegian Women Really Want? That really sparked a debate, and many famous people, without knowing my name or whatever, were talking about this article I wrote. It kind of touched a nerve on feminism, and So I get a lot of feedback, like personal emails, people who write to me and tell me they agree or they disagree, or they cried while reading my blog posts, or they forgot to cook food for their children because they read one and then they couldn't stop. And so it's very funny. I get many different kind of, or people who want to meet me for coffee because they have no friends, or it's quite a funny range of reactions.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that your blog has been a huge success. It's one of the first I came across. It's probably one of the first many expats come across when they first moved to Norway. And I think it's that humorous element that really strikes a chord with people. But how do you strike a balance between the humour that you write, poking fun at Norwegians, and not kind of going too far, being that we're all guests in this country? Where how do you get that balance right?
Well, the thing is, I really like living in Norway, so that balance is not hard for me to keep, because I actually like living here, and the reason I'm still here after almost 8 years is because I really like Norway, and I'm very happy to be here, and I enjoy living here almost every day. So for me, when sometimes I make fun of Norwegian habits or Norwegian people or Norwegian language, but I think people know that it's with a good heart. I don't mean bad. I'm not bashing Norway, and I don't feel, I mean, this is not what I feel. So I think that's not what comes out of my blog post. I hope, at least. Of course, things can be misunderstood, but
Sure. Is that the reason you wrote in English, perhaps, rather than in French or even in Norwegian, to give a sort of international perspective on these points, and something that everybody could understand, whether they were from America, whether they were from Britain, from France, from Norway?
yeah, I thought at that time I started a little bit in French, and then I thought French people who move to Norway, they should speak English. So if I write in English, I will touch French people, but also other people who have English either as a native language or who are from Lithuania, or I don't know from where, from Russia. And so it's kind of a neutral language in a way, because it's not my native language. So I don't have many cultural references to, British culture or American culture. For me, English is just a tool to communicate. It's like when two foreigners speak English together and they have English as a second language, and they speak kind of broken English, but they still understand each other. I mean, this is what I was betting on. I was thinking it's not perfect, but it will be good enough for everyone to understand. And my Norwegian wasn't good enough for me to write in Norwegian at that time. And it's still hard for me to convey humor in Norwegian in its written form. Because I think humor is so difficult in a language. It's so difficult to master. It's, I think, the highest level to master a language. It's very, very difficult.
Sure.
And irony and sarcasm, I mean, all these things can be misunderstood very, very quickly if you don't write it well enough.
Going back to what you were saying about sparking a debate in one post in particular, and you've been invited on NRK and TV2, I think, and a few other. I mean, for those people who are listening that don't know the Norwegian media, these are the top media outlets in Norway. This is national television, national radio. When you're invited on, are you positioned as, here's this foreigner that's written this critical article, or is everyone understanding that this is a humorous take on Norwegian life, and you're just having a conversation about it? Is there any negativity there?
Well, it depends why they invite me, because journalists always have an agenda.
Sure.
They don't just invite you to talk about whatever you want to talk about. They have a program about one specific topic, and then they've kind of assumed that you're going to be saying this or that. So I got some media attention before I published my book, which was released in the end of March 2017 in Norwegian. But it's from the moment I published that book that I really got invited much more to talk about my book and my experience in Norway as a foreigner in general terms. But sometimes I'm asked if I write an article which strikes a chord, then I'm asked to talk about that specific topic. But it's been very hard for me to talk about, like, when people are quite negative about what I write, it's been hard for me to go in the media and explain it, because Norwegian is like my fourth language. And once, for example, on that article about women, I got there's a Norwegian journalist in one of the biggest newspapers in Norway who said that I was a threat to Norwegian feminism. And we were invited, both of us, on a debate live on TV2 Nyhetskanal to debate on this. And I said no, because she would have destroyed me in like 10 seconds. It's not my language. I don't master the cultural references to feminism, to history, to whatever. And I didn't stand a chance, especially live television. So So I refused that one, but now I'm going more and more and kind of exposing myself, especially now during the election. And my Norwegian is getting also more fluent, so I'm trying to accept also these challenging parts for me. Yeah, and just going with the flow and hoping that I won't look like an idiot, basically.
Sure. I mean, how
Yeah.
does it feel to be giving interviews on the topic of the Norwegian nationality and psychology and sociology in your fourth language? I mean, that must be an amazing experience to.
Yeah, it's
to
very
do.
strange. It's very, very strange, and Norwegians love to hear about themselves. And this is also one thing I learned with my blog, is that I wrote my blog for foreigners like me to kind of like be, anonymous pals on this integration route. Like, okay, I understand you. I'm going through the same thing. And then I realized that a huge amount of Norwegians were reading my blog. And especially the blog post I wrote about language, like trying to help foreigners learn Norwegian. It's actually Norwegians reading those posts. And so many times I get these interviews of Norwegian media, whether it's the press or the radio or television, and all they want to know is how I see Norwegians, and they want to hear how they are seen from the outside, and you know that obviously as well. They're very interested in knowing what foreigners have to say about them and what they like about Norway and what's difficult, and et cetera, et cetera. So, and they love when I talk about misunderstandings in the language, when I mix up two words, and they absolutely love that.
Sure, I completely 100% agree. The same thing happens to me. I get invites to coffee from Norwegians and they want to discuss, one sentence from a blog post or something that put me right. And it's great. I mean, most of my audience and most of the people listening to this are outside Norway, Norwegian Americans and Brits who are really into Scandinavian lifestyle. But I do have a fair share of Norwegians who listen as well. So good stuff. Lorelou, this is super stuff. We're going to take a short break, and afterwards I want to talk about some of the blog posts that have really done well and caught the attention of Norwegians.
Okay.
This episode of the Life in Norway show is proudly sponsored by the Moon Norway Guidebook. Whether you're hoping to see the famed Northern Lights, explore Norway's fjords, or visit its beautiful and historical cities, Moon Norway has activities for every traveller. With itineraries like The Best of Norway by Rail and Norway for Families, expertly crafted maps, gorgeous photos, and trustworthy advice from yours truly, Moon Norway provides the tools for planning your perfect trip. Get your copy now from Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or your local bookstore. And now, back to the show. Welcome back to the Life in Norway show. I'm talking to Lorelou from the A Frog in the Fjord blog. And it's not just a blog, is it, Lorelou? You now have a book deal.
Yes, I got a book deal with a Norwegian publisher called Cappelen Dam. And I wrote the book in English. It's about the first year of a foreigner in Norway, with all the good and bad things that can happen in that year and the things one doesn't understand, and some explanations on the background of why Norwegians react like that and why are there so many American people with Norwegian background, for example. Yeah. And now I'm trying to get it published in English. So yeah, it's a new adventure. We're going to see. It got quite a good response with the Norwegian public. So now I'm hoping to see how it will be with foreigners, and I think it will be, for Norwegians, it's more entertainment because they read about themselves. But I think for foreigners, they can actually learn something without it being a guidebook. It's kind of a humor, taking you on a journey of this girl, which is myself, in her first year in Norway.
Sure thing. Well, I've certainly seen the book available in bookstores here in Trondheim. And I really hope you manage to find a publisher to turn this into an English book, because I know certainly the majority of people listening to this podcast would love to read a copy of that in English. So if it does happen, make sure to let me know, and I'll let all our listeners know.
Thanks.
Anyway, back to the blog that inspired the book. I have my own personal favourite articles, and I'm going to ask you about a couple of those later, because I'm really intrigued as to where the inspiration came from. But I believe there's one post in particular that stands out for you as your favourite. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that and why you've picked that one in particular.
Yeah, my favorite is called How to Pretend to be Fluent in Norwegian. It's not necessarily the most read blog post, but I find that one very funny because it was in the beginning when I was learning Norwegian, and I was getting so much input, which was so confusing for me. So I was trying to pretend that I was better at Norwegian than I really was. So I was just catching all these small sentences and pieces of words and putting them together, and then learning expressions. And then I just wrote this blog post, and I still laugh when I read it because it's just so random. And I give this advice, which is completely, useless in a way, but at the same time, quite humorous.
Sure. I think what I'll do now for the benefit of listeners is to just read an excerpt from that post. Now, I find this just hilarious, and it's so true. But here we go. Before anything, you will need to master Norwegian pronunciation and melody. This will help you hide your lack of vocabulary. 30 words well pronounced will make you appear more fluent than 500 words pronounced so badly that no one understands you even after repeating 3 times. Now, I think that it's funny. Yes, it's humorous, but it's so true. You have to really nail the pronunciation to get any traction in Norwegian at all. What sort of a response did you get from Norwegians on this post?
Actually, not that much, because I wrote this at a time when I didn't have the amount of readers that I have now. So I got much more response on the other blog post I wrote about Norwegian language, like how to differentiate Norwegian dialects. I got 150 comments on that one. I wrote many articles on language. How to learn Norwegian or die trying. That was another one.
What's your favorite Norwegian dialect?
No, with no doubt, Tromsø. I love Northern Norwegian dialects.
It's the melody or something else?
It's the melody, but also Northern Norwegian dialects allow for much more swearing, and I think it's much more free. I feel like they are more Latin, like me from the south of France. They are from the north of Norway. It's kind of a bit the same culture. They speak louder, and I don't know, I feel like it's more suited to my personality and my own culture.
You said earlier you can speak 4 languages, obviously French and English. Norwegian is one. What's the 4th?
The 4th is Indonesian.
Wow.
Yeah, I have a bachelor in Indonesian and Malaysian studies, and so I've been working on Indonesia for many, many years, and that's actually also one of the reasons why I came to Norway. It was very hard for them to recruit someone who spoke fluent Indonesian.
I see. So with a knowledge of French and a knowledge of English and a knowledge of Indonesian, how did you find learning Norwegian? Did having a knowledge of 3 languages already make that process easier? Or did you find, with it being such a small vocabulary and the pronunciation and the melody being so important, that made things more difficult?
Well, the language wasn't easier. It's just knowing other languages and having learned other languages. I knew that learning a language was just a code you had to crack, right? So
sure.
If you just copy what other people say and the way they say it, at some point you're going to get it right if you learn the grammar. So I just knew I had to crack the code, but it didn't really help me. I mean, French didn't help me to learn Norwegian because the pronunciation is different, the melody is different. The words mean different things. And if I had been Dutch, I had Dutch people in my Norwegian classes who were very annoying because they were learning Norwegian so fast and I was just behind. And they could just know intuitively what those Norwegian words meant. And I had no idea. I mean, skinke, ham, for Dutch or German speakers, that's obvious. for me, it doesn't mean anything. I don't know if it means table or wall or, I have no idea. So, but I made it eventually. And I think asking a lot of questions, being kind of annoying sometimes, I felt a bit annoying, but I think Norwegians really appreciate that people try to learn their language and actually try to understand what lies behind, janteloven and what does koselig mean and all these things which are a bit difficult to understand, which are more cultural than just language. I've sparked many debates among my friends and colleagues with those questions.
For listeners that don't know what janteloven and koselig means, we'll certainly be featuring those words on future episodes, I think, as they are very core to life in Norway. But on the topic of language, I'd like to ask you about one particular favourite post of mine, which was called "Is Norwegian a Language of Love?" Now, what got me amused, first of all, about that article was the way you open by talking about most people's opinion of the French language is that it's a language of love, but actually you're talking about buying onions or something like, I can't remember the line exactly. Could you talk a bit about that post? And because actually, although it's a funny post, there are some really interesting points about the language in there.
Yeah, well, Norway, as you know, has two official languages, bokmål and nynorsk. And so I looked into the ways, first of all, the ways those two languages talk about love, and also the way that Norwegians say that they love someone or something. And it's actually very complicated for someone who is not Norwegian. But I also, the reason why I wrote this article in the first place is that I wanted to write for the newspaper for Valentine's Day. And I felt like this was a good topic to talk about Norwegian culture. And then I started asking around, how do you say I love you? And people got really shy and no, you cannot say jeg elsker deg. You have to say jeg liker deg and then jeg er glad i deg. And there were so many levels and I got so confused. And so that was the reason why I expressed all the things, all those differences in the blog. And I understood that it wasn't that easy. It's not easy to say that you love something or someone in Norway.
Sure. I mean, to give an example, if you put in I love you into Google Translate, for example, now I haven't done this, but I imagine it says jeg elsker deg. But certainly in the UK and the US, to say I love you to somebody, you'd use that to family, to even friends in certain circumstances, not just your soulmate. Whereas jeg elsker deg in Norwegian has a very specific meaning, right?
Yeah, and actually when I raised this issue at lunchtime with my colleagues, I remember that my boss, who is like above 50, like maybe 55, he said to me, jeg elsker deg is something you say to your wife once, and if she asks you, why aren't you saying it more often to me, you say, I'll let you know if it changes. So, tough love.
Fantastic. Staying on the topic of love, being careful not to cross a line here. Another one of my favorite articles, and I think this probably did really well because I saw it in the top posts widget that you have on the blog, is called The Norwegian Art of Seduction.
Yeah.
Now, you in this post, I recommend everyone listening to the podcast to go and read it. I'll put the link in the show notes. Pause the podcast, go read it, and come back if you have to. You talk about three codes or three instructions,
keys,
yes,
yeah.
Which are eye contact, the inversion of roles, and alcohol. Now, I've, as far as I can remember, never dated a Norwegian, so I'm not so au fait with dating rules in Norway. But maybe you could explain a little bit about what you mean with eye contact, inversion of roles, and specifically alcohol.
Yeah, well, the thing is that as a French woman, I've been used to getting a lot of attention from men, including attention I didn't want to get. Like I'm in the metro in Paris and some guy starts, putting his hand on my knee or something and I don't even know him. But you are used as a woman in these Latin countries to get a lot of attention and you can kind of play hard to get and this is how it goes, right? The guy tries to seduce you and all this. But then in Norway, I remember the first 2 years, it was so strange because I was in these parties and men would look at me for a few seconds and then look away. And I was thinking, what's happening here? Like, he's not smiling, he's not talking to me. And I could see there was some kind of interest, but it was so subtle. I make this comparison in my blog post. It's like French men have this, 4x2 meter sign saying, "Hey, I'm interested." And Norwegians have like a post-it that they have in their pocket, and they just show it for 2 seconds, and they hope that you're going to get the hint. And then alcohol, because obviously alcohol has a huge role to play in matchmaking in Norway, either for one-night stands, which is, I think Norway is one of the top countries for one-night stands in the world with other Scandinavian countries. And also for relationships, because people aren't as inhibited when they drink. And this is also difficult. French people drink a lot, but we don't, I've never got drunk, like completely drunk, and then, it's not in the equation in a way if you like someone. And then the last thing, the inversion of roles, because women in Norway have a much bigger role than in France. I think they're much less passive. So if they want a guy, if they like a guy or a woman, they're going to go for it. In France, women are a bit like, I think it's still quite conservative. So women can't be too out there. Otherwise, people tell you you're a whore or something. So I think it's very different. And it took me years and years. And now I have a Norwegian partner, but he's not very typical Norwegian. In the first years I was here, I thought Norwegians didn't like me because I wasn't tall and blonde. Because they were never showing interest. And then I understood after a while, no, they are actually. It's just invisible to me.
Excellent stuff. The last blog post I want to talk about, and I imagine this is a lot of people's favourites, weird things Norwegians do. In particular, this is what I would call a listicle. You list, I don't know how many weird things, but I also think that you may have written a follow-up to this, more weird things Norwegians do. So are these things unique to Norwegians? Are there really this many things that strike you as weird about Norwegians specifically?
I think some of the things I list are Scandinavian. I think they would apply to Swedes and to Danes to some extent. But some things are really linked to Norwegian history and Norwegian culture, and the fact that this country, this nation has been very poor, very isolated, with very rough weather, not growing much, in a way colonized or occupied by Denmark and Sweden. So they have a very particular culture, and I think a lot of these weird things come from there. But I've also written other blog posts in the same style, one called, I think, Annoying Things Some Norwegians Do, and another one, Wonderful Things Most Norwegians Do. And so I've gotten a lot of good and negative response to these blog posts, because some people don't see the humor in them and they take it very personally. But it's that Weird Things Norwegians Do got a huge amount of readership online in Norwegian and in English.
One of the items on this list in particular, you talk about how Norwegians are allowed to complain about the things in their country. Bad roads, the canteens in schools, the oil money not being spent in the right way. But if a foreigner raises just one of those arguments, then you'll be down, and the person will get all defensive. So based on that point alone from the blog post, you actually raise a lot of points that could be deemed critical about Norway. You do it in a humorous way, but certainly people could view these as critical. So does this item relate to you? Do you get a lot of people being defensive, and how do you respond to a Norwegian that takes offense at something that you write?
Well, that's a good question. The more readership I get and the more critical people get, because more people read, so more people are negative, but also a lot of people are positive. But I feel like because I really like Norway, and because I actually read Norwegian literature, I read about Norwegian history. You were talking about Janteloven. It comes from a book that most Norwegians haven't read,
Sure.
From Aksel Sandemose. I love Norwegian language, so I feel like I'm really doing my share to integrate in this society. And I feel like it's okay not to think that everything is perfect. I don't think everything is perfect in my own country, and that's fine. So I try to take it with a pinch of salt that not everybody can like everything I write, and but it doesn't mean that I'll stop writing. I remember after one of my most read blog posts is called "How to Make Things Crucially." And after that, I wrote some political articles about Norwegian politics. And I remember receiving these emails of people saying, "We just want foreigners to write about Kushli. We don't want you to write about politics. We don't want you to write about serious things. We just want to see ourselves on this sweet, cute aspect of things." And I understand that, but I can't have only that role because I'm interested in so many things in this country. So I can't just limit myself to, cute things. And
Yeah, and I think it's only fair to say that in the Norwegian press they talk about Donald Trump and Brexit and things like this just as much as they do domestic issues. So it's only fair that someone in your position is then allowed to comment on Norwegian politics.
Yeah, and I feel like in a way, I don't know if I'm right, but I feel like because I really like Norway and because I'm here for a reason, I feel like I've given myself in a way the right to say also what I find worrying. And especially if I say it in Norwegian, I feel like the Norwegians take it much more positively because then I'm on the same level playing field. I speak the language, I'm using their references, and I'm saying that I disagree. But the key in Norway is not to be conflict oriented and not to be aggressive. And then you go, I think, a long way. And there are many people who think like me on many issues, and there are many people who disagree. And I think that's the price to pay to be like what they call samfunnsdebattant, to be debating in the public, what's it called? Yeah, to be present in the public debate, to have an opinion. And then obviously some people are going to be agreeing with you and some others aren't. But that's what's funny, right? I mean, that's what's fun. Maybe not funny always, but that's what's interesting.
Sure. Great stuff. Well, we are almost out of time, but before we go, I'd like to ask you 3 quick questions. And if you can give some quick answers, that would be great. What's the best thing about living in Norway?
I think it's the lack of arrogance of people, even people in power, people who are very rich, politicians. They cannot afford not to be close to the people. And I think that's very refreshing coming from France.
Sure. What do you find most challenging about living in Norway?
I would say the food, but it's getting better, but it's difficult. And the weather, obviously.
When you say food, do you mean eating out restaurants or more the availability of food in supermarkets?
No, I come from south of France. We have, squash and fresh tomatoes and olive oil and mozzarella. Everything is very local and it just grows a few kilometers from us. And here everything is imported. So I really love Norwegian food, Norwegian products, but I find it hard with so many products imported. And then the weather, I come from south of France. It's very warm there, very sunny, very light. And in the winter in Norway, it gets really tough for me.
Sure. I don't think you're the only one. Final question. What's your favorite place in Norway?
I have many. I like Røros a lot in Trøndelag. I like Tromsø as a city. If it wasn't for the long winter without any sunlight for 3 months, I think I would move there. I like the Lofoten Islands. I would dream of going to Finnmark. I haven't been there yet. Yeah.
So to choose between Lofoten, Røros or Tromsø?
I think I would choose Tromsø.
Okay, fantastic. Lorelou, where is the best place for people to find out more about what you write?
I think my blog is a good start. I just write about anything from politics to love to language to, just about anything.
And the blog is afroginthefjord.com.
Exactly. And then hopefully in my book, which will come out soon, which is a story over 1 year, so a bit longer, much longer than the blog, and going a bit deeper in some topics.
Great stuff, Lorelou. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks a lot.
You can find out more, including full show notes from today's podcast, at www.lifeinnorway.net.